Hi, everybody. Governor Roy Cooper here. Happy Juneteenth. I'm glad to join you all in celebrating this momentous event in our country's history. This is a day to celebrate Black liberation, freedom, and independence, to reflect on the progress that civil rights leaders and everyday people have made over the decades, but it's also a day to recognize the progress that still must come. Despite the cause of freedom finally reaching the furthest corners of our nation 156 years ago, we still have more work to do to eliminate racism and prejudice in our communities. When we reflect on our history, we can learn from the painful lessons of the past to create a more just and equitable future. It's critical that we tackle the long-standing racial inequities in our education, economic, criminal justice, and healthcare systems. I'm committed to creating real change in our state that keeps working to make North Carolina a place where everybody has the opportunity to thrive. Thanks for your commitment to making our state a more just, equitable place to live and work.
Thank you, Governor Roy Cooper. We appreciate you and those timely remarks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual program here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Tonight's program is entitled Juneteenth, A Story of Freedom. My name is Chrystal Regan, and I'm the Education Section Chief here at the museum. I will serve as your moderator and co-host. Our goal tonight is to engage you in an educational conversation about Juneteenth, an event, a milestone in our nation's history that originated in Galveston, Texas, and presently being learned about and commemorated all over the nation and the world. We want to examine the history behind this holiday and reveal why its commemoration is especially important in light of the recent United States Senate vote and discussions all over our nation about history education, race, and slavery. We will spend the bulk of tonight's program exploring North Carolina's special connections to this historic event and share details about Raleigh's inaugural Juneteenth celebration. Our key presenter tonight is my wonderful colleague, Mr. Earl Ijames, Curator of African American Agriculture and Community History here at the museum. Earl is a former archivist and has served and continues to serve on numerous boards and committees, including as a historic preservationist board member for Preservation North Carolina. Earl is a farmer, and he's a seventh generation North Carolinian. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have tonight. But before we get started, I'd like to make a few announcements. We will have our chat open tonight, and in the event we have time, we will do a question and answer session. Please enter your questions and comments there, and our museum educator, Ms. Michelle Carr, will assist us with some housekeeping and share information throughout the session. We ask that you keep your questions and comments respectful and relevant to the subject matter. I'll now turn it over to Earl and open with this question. But before we do that, let's do a little test with the chat. Let's do a quick roll call. Where are you from? And thank you for joining us tonight. If you're from North Carolina, we'd love to hear where. If you're from the United States, and I know we have some international friends as well.
San Diego, California, Greensboro, Raleigh, Coatesville, Curator, Georgia.
Oh, this is awesome. So continue to enter into the chat where you're from, and we are so excited to have all of you with us tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Earl Ijames.
Well, thank you, Chrystal, and thank everyone for joining us. Again, my name is Earl Ijames. I'm one of the curators here at the North Carolina Museum of History, and we have the honor of presenting this inaugural Juneteenth program from the museum virtually, as part also of this civic season, which is a new product, Chrystal, that the Smithsonian has rolled out this year that helps all Americans understand and have a better frame of freedom for everyone. So the Smithsonian is going to help us celebrate freedom from Juneteenth and this event all the way through the 4th of July, so that we make freedom equitable and understanding that Juneteenth is a holiday for us, has been for many years, Emancipation Day down here. And now, as you mentioned, the Senate is making it a national holiday. And so it's my distinct honor and privilege to be able to put together a program, and you know how we do, Chrystal, we have to get spiced up, and I even got a new haircut for this occasion. So we have a special presentation called Freedom Coming, Freedom for All, as a celebration for Juneteenth. And a lot of our presentation is derived from past exhibits, particularly the Freedom Coming, Freedom for All, a celebration and commemoration of Juneteenth. And so as you see on the screen, a quote from Frederick Douglass that says, "The Emancipation Proclamation was like a burst of heaven," is what Frederick Douglass exclaimed in 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln issued the proclamation on January 1st. So you asked the question, what is Juneteenth? Great question. So part of that answer we're going to list here, and you see on the screen, June 19th, 1865, or when news of the Emancipation Proclamation and, by that time, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, or the Freedom Amendment, as it's commonly called, reached the last formerly enslaved people who were in Texas at that time, or the furthest westernmost state in the Confederacy. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and 2 months after the end of the Civil War here in North Carolina. And by the way, for those who don't know, the Civil War actually ended. The last unconditional truce was signed in April 1865 at a place called Bennett's Farm, or Bennett's Place, that is in present-day Durham, North Carolina. And we actually have a state historic site called Bennett Place that is designated to help and to tell this story about Emancipation Day, or Juneteenth, as it relates particularly in North Carolina in April 1865 at the end of the war. So on the screen, you see kind of an equation that I put together to help people better understand. 1863 to 1865, Emancipation Day itself is established in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. 1865 through 1866, Juneteenth in Texas took place over the course of a year from June 19th, 1865 to June 30th, 1866. And again, that freedom that was being spread throughout the state of Texas was not only for people formerly enslaved, but the 13th Amendment itself outlaws slavery and doesn't specifically mention African Americans per se. And we'll get into that.
Okay.
So freedom coming is what the formerly enslaved people whispered through the grapevine. So what you see on the screen is an image of the 1862 Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And it served notice to the 11 Confederate states to return to the Union by New Year's Day, 1863, or their, quote, slaves would be declared free on January 1st, 1863. Interestingly, or ironically, that's the same day that the Confederate Army would begin hiring out enslaved men. And in the slave states in general, that was a day that people were typically bought and sold or hired out. So it made no mention of enslaved people in those states not in rebellion, however. And so again, this image is from the exhibit that we had at the North Carolina Museum of History called Freedom Coming, Freedom for All. And the image is also courtesy of the National Archives and Records Administration.
Okay. So Earl, I want to interject, very quickly. We're talking about January 1, and thinking about January 1 or January 1st, there are a few things that come to mind. Of course, we think about Emancipation Day. We also, those folks who are, Black Christians, we think about First Night, as some sophisticated folks say, or where I'm from, we say watch night, because we're watching that new year come in, but we know it has other symbolic meanings. We also think about January 1st in terms of Haitian independence and what that revolution meant to African Americans and the fear that Haitian independence stoked in slaveholders. And then the other thing that really comes to mind is when those of us who do a lot of genealogy work, we think about some of those ancestors who have January 1 listed as a stand-in, if you will, birthday,
That's right.
because they were denied that knowledge.
Exactly.
So January 1st has a lot of meaning and a lot of roots, particularly for African
Well,
Americans.
you're right, Chrystal. And in the context of the war, the time frame of the Civil War, 1861 to 65, in 1863, there was no Juneteenth then.
Right.
But here in North Carolina, with the news of the emancipation and the movement and the creation of the United States colored troops, there was an actual anticipation by the people. So you made the mention, first night watch, as we said, up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at my church where we grew up. And I always wondered why every single New Year's Eve, I couldn't go out anywhere else but the church. And so later we found out, and I learned as I grew older, that it was a first night watch, or as you say down in Eastern North Carolina.
Watch night.
Watch night, yes. And so this is what the tradition was, and many of our churches still observe that.
That's right.
And it's equitable to Juneteenth. And so that's a good point. You also mentioned the Haitian Revolution that led to Haitian independence. But I'll bet many people didn't know that the United States government did not actually recognize the nation of Haiti until 1864, after the emancipation and during the exploits of the United States colored troops.
And that's another program, because we could really dive into Haiti and the Louisiana Purchase and Toussaint and all of that. So let's move to North Carolina.
Yes.
And its significance.
Very good. So what is North Carolina's role in Juneteenth? So again, after the 1862 pre-Emancipation Proclamation and the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people in North Carolina sought freedom again behind Union troops around New Bern, North Carolina. And this is very important because New Bern, North Carolina will be commemorating its Juneteenth celebration of freedom on June 19th. And as I was speaking with some of the planners of that event, they're going to be unveiling the Freedom Trail. But they're also reminding people that, hey, Juneteenth in Texas was 3 years after General Ambrose E. Burnside landed with that amphibious landing at New Bern and made New Bern a Union stronghold and attracted people, freedom seekers, literally from across Eastern North Carolina, effectively affecting Juneteenth for Eastern North Carolina at that time. So New Bern, in its commemoration of Juneteenth on June 19th, will be reminding people and educating people about March 14th, 1862, when those Union troops captured the former capital, or the colonial capital of North Carolina, which is New Bern. And so around New Bern, a fervent abolitionist who had been handpicked by President Abraham Lincoln, his name is General Edward Augustus Wild, and he headed the recruitment of the United States colored troops in North Carolina. And so freedmen, or people who were formerly enslaved, like William Henry Singleton and Fernie Bryant of Craven County, a man named Luke Martin of Martin County, Abraham Galloway from New Hanover County, and Jack Sherrod of Wayne County led the charge to raise several regiments of United States colored troops here in North Carolina. Also, free people of color joined the United States colored troops. People like Parker David Robbins, who was part Roanoke Indian and part African American. And he enlisted from Gates County when he joined the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry. And what you see on the screen is a sketch of a man named Sergeant Bob, who served with the 1st North Carolina Volunteers, or that regiment was later federalized as the 35th United States Colored Troops. And he was from Pasquotank County, North Carolina, which is the Elizabeth City area. And this is a sketch that was done by a correspondent who was embedded in the Union Army at that time. And this sketch can be found in the State Archives of North Carolina. So the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation also called for the voluntary, quote, colonization of persons of African descent to Panama, Haiti, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. But when the Confederate states, those 11 Confederate states at that time, I think it's very important to remind people that those 11 Confederate states were actually winning the war at this point. And for President Abraham Lincoln to actually change the course of the war, he had to introduce the Emancipation Proclamation as a new platform or as a new reason to prosecute the war, because up to that point, the war was being fought to bring North Carolina and the other 10 Confederate states back into the Union, albeit Chrystal as slave states.
Right.
Still, so
Earl, while we're there, let's jump on that because we're getting some questions from our panelists, and some of them can wait until the end, but those that come in that are perfect for the time in your presentation. Can you take just a minute though and explain the Emancipation Proclamation? I think when we get back to American mythology and this notion that the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and not conflating the Emancipation Proclamation with Juneteenth. So can you make that distinction talk about that for a minute?
The Emancipation Proclamation, excellent question, is by President Lincoln's admission himself a wartime measure that is used in several different means, but mostly it was used as a platform, as a way to change the trajectory of the war and allow people from African Americans, formerly enslaved, people of African descent, people who used to be called, quote, colored, to actually enlist and enroll in the United States Army.
Right.
For the first 70 years of American history, from 1792 and the first Congress, all the way through 1862, it was not legal for African Americans to actually serve in the Army. And so the Emancipation Proclamation afforded Lincoln a war measure as commander-in-chief to raise these regiments. And so these regiments were enlisted for 3-year commissions from 1863, May and June 1863, through June 30th, 1866, which again is part of that Juneteenth.
Right.
And so it's important to know that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anyone per se, because what it does is it, in the words of Secretary of State Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, it encouraged those people in Confederate territories to leave and go to Union territories, but it plainly, Lincoln had these reservations about, quote, property. So these people who were not in rebellion, and there were also, important to note, Chrystal, slave states that were not in the Confederacy.
Oh yeah, the border states.
These states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. They were slave states, and Lincoln was very sensitive to them not to, quote, confiscate their property.
That's right.
So the Emancipation Proclamation itself didn't hold water once the war ended. And so that's part of Juneteenth also.
You're right. And I think that's a good way to make sure everyone's on the same page with that understanding, and to remember that enslaved folks had been running away. And this was also a good political move to say, well, we're still in charge and we want to be able to say, we're setting this ball in motion, but the cat was already out the gate.
Well, and like we mentioned, when President Lincoln, he was the first president in American history to even utter the words emancipation. You could not get elected on that platform at that time. And so, as it was so eloquently pointed out by Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation Proclamation was like a burst from heaven. And the people in the grapevine started telling, hey, you heard about that. You heard, if you get behind Union lines, that you would no longer be returned to a state of slavery, because that was the actual policy.
Right.
It was called contraband.
That's right.
And so if you thought that you would leave your plantation or leave from behind Confederate lines and go to Union lines and be, quote, free, you were mistaken.
Right.
The Union was obliged to return you to a state of slavery. That's to underscore that until the Emancipation Proclamation took place, that the war is being prosecuted to bring those 11 Confederate states back into the Union, and again, albeit as slave states.
Thank you.
Yeah,
let's move on to the next slide, because we want to make sure we got that part clarified, give that background.
And so again, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed for the creation of the United States Colored Troops, which is a very significant part that literally changed the trajectory of the war itself, and enabled the war to become a war for freedom for everyone. And so the regiments that were raised in North Carolina are very significant, because they play a very important role in what we call Juneteenth. these regiments are raised in North Carolina, and it's important to know that all the Civil War regiments are raised on the state level and they have state designations. And so they're later federalized into federal regiments. And so the regiments that are started in North Carolina are the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd North Carolina Colored Infantries, or what later was federalized as the 35th, the 36th, and 37th United States Colored Troops. And again, they enrolled in New Bern because New Bern had been captured as a Union stronghold and established as a place to actually recruit United States Colored Troops. Then the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry were men who were primarily from northeastern North Carolina. And that's important to note too, because, equestrian sports was the biggest pastime in North Carolina before basketball and before football and before baseball. The biggest sport was horse riding and equestrian. And many of those riders, one of the most famous ones in American history was a Black equestrian named Sir Archie from Northampton County in northeastern North Carolina.
And we know many Black men, some formerly enslaved, dominated the Derby for a long period of time.
Exactly. And as a direct result, a lot of those men with their equestrian skills enrolled in the United States Colored Troops, and enough of them amassed to actually form a cavalry regiment, or what the old timers used to call horse soldiers. They were lethal. They had arms in their boots and their sidearms, and they even had a lot of times rifles mounted on their horses. And so they were really lethal. So the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry were primarily those horse soldiers, so to speak, from northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. And they actually enrolled in Norfolk, Virginia. And the 1st North Carolina Heavy Colored Artillery. And I have here with me a special guest, a member of the 14th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. This is Private Frank Worthington. He escaped slavery and sought freedom from Pitt County, North Carolina, and actually made it through the slave catchers and the Confederate Home Guard from Pitt County across the county line to Craven County and enroll in the United States Colored Troops. Well, you might say, Chrystal, you're looking at me, well, how do you know that, Earl?
I'm listening.
Well, good question. Many years ago, Private Frank Worthington's great-great-grandson contacted me and wanted to know how he could connect his Civil War ancestor, because he had oral history from his grandfather dating back that they had ancestors, an ancestor in particular, who was in the United States Colored Troops in North Carolina. Well, he lived in Washington, D.C., and his name was Wellington. And he just couldn't make the match. And so we have this special word phrase that we use in genealogy, where we take names that look and sound alike and break them down into a soundex, just in case names, you know how we have this Eastern North Carolina slang, and sometimes people may not necessarily understand, but if you decode it, it breaks into the same code. So Wellington turned out that we learned from his United States pension application that during the process of seeking freedom from Pitt County, you got to remember this, now people escaping slavery, the bloodhounds are on your, their broadsides with your name on it. So we learned that Worthington changed his name to Wellington and actually enlisted in the 14th United States Colored Heavy Artillery, where he served in that unit during the duration. And on his pension application, he actually admitted that he had changed his name because he was scared that people would catch him. So that is part of our genealogy and understanding, but he effected his own Juneteenth of freedom in 1863 by leaving Pitt County and crossing over the river and Hugo Creek, I think they call it, and going over into Craven County. So then the last regiment that's formed here in North Carolina is the 135th United States Colored Troops that formed at Goldsboro, which we'll get into later. So and again, the 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry brought freedom for all to the Confederate capital that you saw the Juneteenth celebration, or the Emancipation Day celebration on the cover in Richmond, Virginia, around the turn of the 20th century. They were commemorating the fall of Richmond, or their Juneteenth, in April of 1865, and 36 U.S. colored troops and the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry were part of that. And so the image that you see on the screen is from Harper's Weekly in February 1864, and it's entitled, quote, "Colored Troops under General Wow Liberating Slaves in North Carolina after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation." And again, this was February 1864 when this was recorded. And so this is equitable to the Juneteenth that we talk about. And this is happening all over Eastern North Carolina by early 1864. So what you see on the screen here is a Colt revolver that belonged to a man who was formerly enslaved in Craven County named William Henry Singleton. And Singleton did something that was not an anomaly, so to speak, because as I mentioned, it was illegal for Black people to serve in the Army before 1863. And so what he did is he sought permission from his slaveholder to actually serve in the Confederate Cavalry. And he served in a North Carolina Confederate Cavalry until the December 1862 Battle of Kinston, North Carolina. And during that battle, he actually escaped from Confederate lines to James City, which is the area around New Bern, North Carolina, where the United States colored troops were being recruited. And when he got there, the Union soldiers, Chrystal, they suspected that he was a Confederate spy. And they put him in the brig, according to his autobiography. And so when the officers from the North Carolina Confederate Cavalry sought return per that Union contraband policy that we mentioned, the Union officials refused because Lincoln had just issued the pre-Emancipation Proclamation that was about to go over to the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Singleton actually helped to began the recruitment of that 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry at the Union-occupied New Bern. And that 1st North Carolina, again, was later federalized as the 35th USCT. At first were not issued firearms because they were expected to dig latrines. And you've seen that movie Glory, yes, and how that is depicted. And that's an accurate depiction, because when these regiments were first raised, Chrystal, they were not expected to actually fight and gain glory of being soldier and being men. You remember the Constitution said these were 3/5 people. And the idea and the feeling among a lot of Americans was that these people couldn't fight. They didn't know how to be men or soldiers. And so Singleton took exception to this, and he insisted on arms and uniforms, and he escaped across the Neuse River there to train his personal recruits with corn stalks based on the training that he had already gotten and his experience in the Civil War. So, and he used that to help train the 35th United States Colored Troops. Incredible. So another man who served in the 35th United States Colored Troops is a man named Private Luke Martin, another freedom seeker from northeastern North Carolina. And this is what you see on the screen is the descriptive registers of the 35th United States Colored Troops that can be found at the State Archives and also at the National Archives. He enlisted in the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry, and you see him on the very bottom right there, Luke Martin, age 25, and he enlists literally on the first day of enrollment of that regiment on May 23rd, 1861. And he escaped during the winter and spring of 1863 from a plantation on the border of Martin County and Washington County, North Carolina, near a town called Plymouth, North Carolina. And according to his family, he actually swam across 3 rivers in the winter of 1863 to get to New Bern and enroll on the first day.
Might have started out as one river, right? By the time he went down.
No, you might say, well, how do you know that, Chrystal? Well, great question.
You said the family said.
Well, great question, because this is his family, right? This is a picture of Luke Martin Jr., who was born in 1917 when Private Luke Martin was 80 years young.
That's amazing.
Amazing. And he was the youngest son of Private Luke Martin. who was born in 1836 and passed away 3 years in 1920 after the man sitting on your left, Luke Martin Jr., was born in New Bern. And so Mr. Luke Martin Jr. is looking at a circa 1900 portrait of his father, who by that time was Reverend Luke Martin. He established one of the most prominent churches in the city of New Bern after the Civil War and after his service. And he's sitting with the world famous William Alex Haley Jr., the son of Alex Haley,
Right.
who accompanied me on this trip and so graciously helped direct me on this interview in 2008 when Mr. Luke Martin shared stories that his family had shared with him about freedom or the Emancipation or later Emancipation Day in New Bern. And again, this is 2 and 3 years before Juneteenth in Texas. And this image was taken in October 2008 on the patio, on Mr. Luke Martin's patio in New Bern.
Now, before, and you may get to this, Earl, later in your presentation, but since we're getting questions from the audience, I think that some of these questions will be relevant to their understanding as we move forward. And one of those questions, and I think a lot of people have this question, what took so long? We're talking about what happened with emancipation and the colored troops. What took so long for that message to get to Texas? Was it just the Texas Confederates refusing to give in? Talk to us about
excellent question.
What makes Texas unique in terms of the messaging and the refusal to acknowledge defeat?
Excellent question. The Union employed a couple of strategies in order to capture the Confederacy, so to speak, and subjugate the Confederacy. 2 main strategies. One is called the Anaconda effect, the Anaconda strategy. And that was essentially coming down the Mississippi River, mainly capturing the large port of New Orleans and Louisiana, and then sweeping east from there, from Louisiana, Arkansas, then there's Mississippi, which, by the way, was the richest state in the Union at that time.
Which Natchez comes
with Natchez, right? And then Alabama. I mean, these states, Mississippi was 2/3 enslaved, 2/3 Black then. Alabama was a majority Black and majority enslaved. And then get over to Georgia, and Georgia was just slightly less than Alabama of enslaved. Then you come east to the tip of the Southeast, there's North and South Carolina. And so what happens is the Anaconda strategy kind of ends right at Alabama and Tennessee. And then General Sherman's, his famous March to the Sea that many people know about.
Right.
Most people know about it from Gone with the Wind, right? So, but I must remind people that Gone with the Wind did not end in Savannah, Georgia. Right. Gone with the Wind actually ended in North Carolina in present-day Durham County. Durham County didn't exist then. It was a place called Durham Station. There was a railroad junction. And the railroad junction beyond that was not even a junction. It was Bennett's Place or Bennett's Farm where that surrender took place. And the largest surrender of Confederate troops, about 192,000, laid down their arms and walked, some of them all the way back to Texas. This news, we didn't have internet then. Right. And we didn't have telephones, sometimes with telegraph, and the telegraph lines, you might have just 1 or 2 in Texas. Texas, even though it was a big state, did not have a large population there. Right. So.
Well, we know with telegraphs and railroads, that was the Union that really took advantage of those technologies.
And the grapevine, word of mouth. And so what you have is essentially, Texas is kind of cut off. And there's these skirmishes that are going back and forth between Confederates and Union. That's another whole topic altogether. Right. But effectively, they were cut off from the main action, from the Anaconda strategy and from Sherman's march, which started around Chattanooga, Tennessee, and came down into Chickamauga, Georgia. And again, most people know about Atlanta and Gone with the Wind. And then by December 1864, General William T. Sherman reaches Savannah and issues that famous 40 acres and a mule speech at the first African church there in Savannah. And most people forget about the march
Right.
then, but that's really when it's just getting started, because General Sherman wanted to turn his guns on Carolina in particular, that started this conflict in his eyes. And so I always remind people, Gone with the Wind should have been filmed in Columbia, South Carolina, because he laid waste to that place.
We can talk about a lot
Yes.
of what should have happened with
happened.
Gone with the
Right.
Wind. So,
But after Columbia, he comes across the Yadkin River into capturing Fayetteville and the Confederate arsenal there in Fayetteville, North Carolina by March of 65. And again, Bentonville and Wayne County and Goldsboro. And so all this action is taking place. And this information, again, is not necessarily being relayed out to Texas.
right.
And again, the final surrender itself, you know, Texas is a huge geographic area. And people from El Paso up to the northern regions up by the Oklahoma Territory, Oklahoma wasn't a state then. And then going all the way down to the port of Galveston and Corpus Christi on the Mexican border and the Rio Grande River there, that's a huge geographical mass and a big disconnect in and of itself. And then if you talk about Texas just by itself, it took the troops a whole year from June 19th, 1865 to June 30th, 1866, just to spread the news
Just to spread the
in
news.
Texas. So that is part of the disconnect
Okay.
of why the folks in Texas learned later.
And thank you for that explanation. And it's interesting you mentioned 40 acres and a mule. It's always nice to think about those histories that everyone makes applicable to their own, because a lot of people talk about, I never got my 40 acres and a mule, which undoubtedly everyone deserved and more, but it wasn't promised to all the formerly enslaved. I like that you mentioned that happened in a specific geographic area,
It did.
but it was adopted. This thing of you owe me was adopted
Right.
by people, freedmen and women all over the South.
And it's important to know that the war hadn't been won. This is a
Right.
political struggle. It's a military struggle. And so in the words of General William T. Sherman, his capture of Savannah was a Christmas present to President Lincoln.
Right.
As a way, you know, between Atlanta and Savannah was the 1864 elections. And again, no president had ever been elected, Chrystal, with a platform of emancipation.
Oh, right.
This
And
was not
neither
a popular thing.
Right.
And so this was part of that process. So as part of that political process, General Sherman gets up in First African Church and says, 40 acres and a mule. And then
Because
the
of where
cat's
we
out of the
were in
bag.
the war.
You're right. But the cat's out of the bag then. So the 35th U.S. Colored Troops, as I mentioned, is the first regiment. And another one of those 1,053 soldiers of the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry was a man named Private John Gaskell of Washington, North Carolina. And Chrystal, I always remind people that Washington, North Carolina is the original Washington, not Little Washington. It's the first Washington. It was actually chartered in 1782, one of the first things after the American Revolution. So this man, John Gaskell, escaped slavery from Washington, North Carolina. And in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Gaskell obtained freedom from slavery. And what you see on the screen is what we think is one of the first known identification tags issued by the United States Army, or what people call a dog tag now. And this was given to Private John Gaskell as his Civil War identification tag. And we were fortunate enough to get this artifact in the North Carolina Museum of History collection, and from Pitt County. And this is just a shameful plug for a curator out to the audience, but we get artifacts like this through reaching audiences of people calling us. And the idea, and I'll tell you the story on how we actually got this artifact. A guy comes from Pitt County and says, I found this old strange looking coin. Can you have a look at it? It has a hole in it. And so the first time I saw it, I said, oh my goodness, this is from the war. And then I did a little research and found out that this could possibly be one of the first dog tags in American history. And it was issued to Gaskell, who sought freedom from Washington, North Carolina to New Bern, and enlisted as a 54-year-old private, Chrystal. He was 54 years young. And if you can imagine 50-something as a private in the Army escaping in the winter of 1863, not unlike Luke Martin, coming through those cold rivers and swamps of eastern North Carolina to get to New Bern and fight for freedom and help to save our Union. And this is, again, a Juneteenth affected essentially for him and freedom for him, but his freedom is going to mean freedom for all and helping to save the liberty of our Union. So again, freedom coming, freedom for all. The final assault on Fort Fisher, North Carolina, January 1865. This is something that we all need to learn about in our history books, Chrystal. Fort Fisher, North Carolina was protected the port city of Wilmington, which was our largest city in North Carolina then, from Union invasion. It also provided cover for countless blockade runners that helped to finance the Confederate war effort. So the Confederacy was getting supplied primarily from the French and the English, who were paying exorbitant black market prices for cotton and tobacco, for naval stores, for indigo, for lumber, for all those products and commodities are being produced by our enslaved ancestors and making Mississippi the richest state, making South Carolina that second richest state, and making North Carolina that fifth richest state in the Union. We were exporting naval stores. We led the world in export of naval stores, which was the production of turpentine, tar, and pitch for building ships primarily, among other things. And so Confederate General Robert E. Lee declared that if the fort fell to the Confederacy, then the Confederacy would soon follow suit. So in other words, Confederate General Lee declared that as long as Fort Fisher stood, we could fight forever, because not only could the Confederacy smuggle goods out, but they were also getting arms smuggled in from the French and the English. And some of those arms helped to actually man Fort Fisher, which was the largest earthen fort in the history of the world, built by enslaved laborers in the Confederacy. And so the Union tried to take the fort, and I mentioned the elections of November 1864 and how pivotal they were. And so after those elections, Lincoln wanted to use a lame duck Congress to vote on the 13th Amendment, to give them political cover, because they will be leaving in January and February and March of 1865. And a new Congress would be sworn in March of 1865 back then. And so that Congress may not be ready or willing to vote on Lincoln's 13th Amendment.
Right.
So he needed to get it to the Congress, get it to the Senate in particular, to the House of Representatives in particular, because the Senate actually did ratify in August 1864 the 13th Amendment. So this political process is going hand in hand with the military process. But the House of Representatives declared that as long as Fort Fisher stood, they would not vote on the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery.
Before you pivot from that, there's a question regarding how these men that we've been talking about all evening, how are they memorialized? In other words, are they buried at the Memorial Cemetery, or do we have any knowledge about those burial markers?
That's a great question. Some of the men who fought at Fort Fisher are actually at the Federal Cemetery in Wilmington. Some are in unmarked graves. And just to know the nature of civil wars, they were not civil war battles. They were not pretty.
Right.
These troops and our American soldiers have protected our freedoms with their lives, literally. And in these Civil War battles, you would see 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people at a time lose their life for liberty. Many times literally dismembered from cannon fodder. And so that's the reason why these dog tags were invented, or these identification tags were invented. And so in places like Wilmington, you have mass graves. Places like Charleston, South Carolina, we have where the 54th and 55th Massachusetts were fighting at the Port Royal campaign there. There's a mass grave that was recently rediscovered. And then here in Raleigh, I recently discovered in our Federal Cemetery here on Tarboro Road, that there are actually United States colored troops buried there from when Sherman had them here in occupation of Raleigh in April of 1865. So we're learning about that, but we need help of genealogists and historians because many times these soldiers were buried in unmarked graves or mass graves. And it is important to know that once we identify positively these graves, these soldiers, these veterans, these heroes are still eligible for markers from the United States Veterans Administration and deserving of that proper recognition. So that's a very good question.
So we're pivoting now to the 13th Amendment.
Well, and let's get to how we got there because this wasn't a sure thing, Chrystal. And the politicians, and again, these are Northern politicians. There were 11 Confederate states minus the US Congress. So these are Northern states and border states who are still trying to make up their mind to vote on the 13th Amendment. And so what they say they need is a military victory. And so in December 1864, the US Army sends, and again, the US Army was segregated then. When they enrolled the United States colored troops, they were segregated. And so they sent the white regulars in, and the Confederate artillery and the Confederate regulars at Fort Fisher literally decimated them. It was embarrassing. And so the United States Army and the War Department and the government had to regroup quickly before the Congress left out of that lame duck session. And so what did they do? They regroup and they reload and launch the largest amphibious assault in world history before D-Day. Now, Chrystal, we've seen the images of black and white video of the 81st and 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, landing at the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944 by the thousands. And what an awesome sight it was. But can you imagine the awesome spectacle it was of the United States colored troop regiments getting off those boats in the middle of January in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Cape Fear River, and they couldn't get their rifles wet for the gunpowder, it wouldn't work. So they had to hold the rifles up in the water and just take that cold water until they got to land. And then they had to endure that unflinching assault by the Confederate artillery at Fort Fisher and the Confederate regulars there. But what happens is after the largest amphibious assault in the history of the world before D-Day, that second battle of Fort Fisher culminates with the 27th United States colored troops raising the United States flag, Old Glory. There were only 36 states then, so 36 stars in the flag back then. 36 states flag is raised over Battery Buchanan at Fort Fisher. And that news is telegraphed, the fastest means of communication back then, to the United States House of Representatives. And what happens is the US House actually takes up the bill and passes the amendment. And what you see on the screen now is a scene in the House of Representatives on the passage of the proclamation to amend the Constitution according to Harper's Weekly, February 1865. And again, the largest earthen fort in the history of the world was surrendered to the 27th United States colored troops, Chrystal. Did you know that?
I did not.
Wow.
Now there's lots
incredible.
Of facts coming out tonight that I was not aware of.
The 27th United States colored troops were actually raised in Ohio. And they were part of that contingency that came down here and fought in that amphibious assault and brought freedom to the lower Cape Fear of North Carolina, which included Brunswick County, Columbus County, Bladen County, New Hanover County, those areas around Wilmington, Duplin County, those areas in southeastern North Carolina. And so the amendment was forwarded from Congress and sent to the 36 states. And by constitutional mandate, 3/4 of those 36 states are required to ratify the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery before it can become law. So now we've transitioned from the military and that pirouette going over to the political struggle to actually outlaw slavery and effect freedom for all and actually get to a Juneteenth. So this is part of the news that actually is taken out to Texas, is that the 13th Amendment is in process of being ratified by the states on June 19th, 1865 through 1860, when Gordon Granger gets out to the port of Galveston, Texas. So the United States War Department, after Fort Fisher was surrendered, you recall, Chrystal, I mentioned General Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas, and how it didn't end in Savannah. At Christmas 1864, it rained and rained and rained in Savannah. And so General Sherman formed a pioneer corps, or in today's language, these would be called engineers. And these men were tasked with building plank roads for 60,000 Union soldiers, ambulance trains, as well as thousands of freedom seekers or people who are affecting their own Juneteenth, literally from Chickamauga, Georgia, all the way back through Atlanta, through Savannah. And once this Pioneer Corps is formed in Savannah, they build pontoon bridges and they build all types of means for Sherman to cross over the Savannah River into South Carolina and head directly to the South Carolina capital of Columbia. And again, if you ever want to see some images of what the real Gone with the Wind looked like, Chrystal, pull those images of Sherman's march of February of 1865 in the state capital of South Carolina. In fact, it was so utterly devastated that very few records of pre-1865 actually exist in the state archives in Columbia. That's how complete the destruction was when Sherman left Columbia, South Carolina. And when he leaves, Sherman, according to his records, he's coming to the land of quicksand. That's what they call North Carolina. And so he definitely needed this regiment to build these corduroy roads. And the specs of corduroy roads were essentially pine trees that were cut down in 20 to 24 foot lengths, and they had to be at least 20 inches on the short end and hewn into a block, and they would be overlain into a corduroy, like so, and mound into a roadbed so that 60,000 troops and thousands of freedom seekers by this point, following Sherman's army, affecting their own Juneteenth from Georgia and Tennessee line through Georgia, South Carolina, and now into North Carolina.
Wow.
And so these people get into Fayetteville, or the Union Army gets into Fayetteville, and they capture the Confederate arsenal and lay waste to it. And effectively, March 1865 is Juneteenth in Fayetteville, North Carolina, because it's liberated from slavery. And in Fayetteville, from there, the Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston sought to protect the state capital of North Carolina from the same fate that Atlanta, Georgia had suffered, and the same fate that Columbia, South Carolina. It was almost a sure bet that the Tar Heel capital was going to be laid to ruins and laid waste. And so the Confederate general kind of formed a block in Johnston County to somewhat prohibit that, and staged the largest land battle in North Carolina history called Bentonville in March of 1865. And it was almost as if General Sherman routed the Confederate army of General Joseph Johnston. And Johnston was forced then to retreat further back. And Sherman proceeds then from Johnston County over to Goldsboro, North Carolina. And you might say, well, why would he go to Goldsboro, Chrystal? Well, great question. Goldsboro was a brand new—
You were supposed to say, I'm glad you asked.
Well, I'm glad you asked. That's a great question.
Go ahead.
Goldsboro was a brand new, shiny city carved literally out of the swamp in the 1840s and built along the longest railroad line in the world by 1840. It was then called the Wilmington and Weldon. It was built by enslaved laborers, part of the enrichment of the state. And those investors got wildly rich from the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. It was constructed from the Virginia, North Carolina line, 140 miles south to the port at Wilmington. And the middle part of that was a new place that they called Goldsboro. And it immediately became a railroad hub because the state of North Carolina took that point and created the North Carolina Railroad, which essentially is from Goldsboro to Smithfield to Raleigh to Hillsboro to Greensboro to Salisbury to Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, if that route sounds familiar, it's very congruent and is actually the corridor that later becomes Interstate 85.
Interstate 85.
Yes. So the 135th United States Colored Troops, once they're in Goldsboro, they helped Sherman capture Goldsboro. And from there, they are charged with building the first road, the first continuous road from Goldsboro to Raleigh. That was not a continuous road. You had to go on those plank roads and the byways, and people wonder why these roads in the country end in one place. Well, this first continuous road from Goldsboro to Raleigh was actually built by the 135th United States Colored Troops that enabled Sherman of his 60,000 troops, and by that point, 40,000 additional troops from General Terry at Fort Fisher had joined him at a place called Faison, North Carolina, and they had swelled to 100,000 Union troops.
Wow.
Wow, we only had 1 million people who lived in the entire state of North Carolina then. So you can imagine, and what I've read according to some of the slave narratives, when they got to Raleigh, there were so many Union soldiers, they were like bluebirds on the earth. So what you see on the screen is a man named Private Jack Sherrod, who literally left the turpentine orchards. He was a real Tar Heel. He was in the forest, enslaved, hacking turpentine, tar, and pitch from the lonely pine trees. And what you see on the right is a cropped image of his 1906 United States pension application. As I mentioned, the 135th USCT built the first continuous road from Goldsboro to Raleigh, North Carolina, bringing freedom, or Juneteenth, from Wayne County through Johnston County into Wake County in March and April 1865. So this man I mentioned in our opening introduction, Parker D. Robbins, a free man of color from Gates County, he enlisted in that famous second U.S. Colored Cavalry that was among the first to bring Juneteenth to Richmond. And so after the war, he was a very prominent individual and one of our first Black lawmakers during Reconstruction. And what you see on the screen is an original oil portrait that's featured in our Story of North Carolina exhibit here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And it was actually donated to our museum collection, Chrystal, in 1977 by Robinson's great-granddaughter, who lived in Magnolia, North Carolina, in Duplin County at that time. Wow. And there's a historic highway marker to him on Highway 903 down there. So what you see on the screen here is the discharge of a man named Private Samuel Sutton, who enlisted from Hertford, North Carolina, or we think Hertford County. Is not clear from it, from the discharge of the 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation. And that regiment again was federalized into 36 USCT. As I mentioned, the 36 was the first Union regiment in Richmond on April 3rd, 1865, capturing the Confederate, on Monday, April 3rd, 1865, capturing the Confederate capital. And you might say, well, how do you know that was Monday, Chrystal? Well, good question. Because
you're glad I asked.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Because Union General U.S. Grant had telegraphed President General Jefferson Davis Sunday, April 2nd, while he was in church, telling him he's coming and bringing the troops to Richmond to capture, and it would be wise for him to surrender. Mm-hmm. He evacuates the Confederate capital, literally leaving Sunday church service. And so that's how we know it's a Monday. So the 36, so Private Sutton and the 36 brought freedom again to from Petersburg, Virginia, and the famous Overland Campaign to Richmond in the spring of 1865 to help end the Civil War. After the Richmond assignment, the 36 was actually reassigned to Texas as part of the June 19th, 1865 Juneteenth, when it was proclaimed at the port of Galveston. And Union General Gordon Granger was discharged, but This discharge of Private Sutton is in January 1866 in Brazoria, Texas. And that is where he actually discharged. We don't know if he stayed in Texas or came back to North Carolina. But General Granger and the USCT spread the news of Emancipation Proclamation, freedom, and Juneteenth throughout Texas until June 30th, 1866, again, when those commissions expired. And what you see on the screen is the January 1866 discharge of Private Samuel Sutton, who originally was from Hertford. And again, we don't know if it's Hertford, North Carolina, which is in Perquimans County,
Right.
right? Not to be confused with Hertford County, North Carolina, where Murfreesboro is. And so both are in northeastern North Carolina. And by the way, there's actually a monument in Perquimans County at the courthouse to the 36 U.S. colored troops. I would encourage you to go and see it. So General Lee telegraphed Davis, as I mentioned, that he must abandon his position in the Confederate capital or be destroyed. And so there was a cause for welcoming the 36 USCT when they came, even for the white people. And to the Black people, it was indeed a deliverance for which they had been praying. And the 36, as I mentioned, spread freedom to Virginia and was reassigned from Virginia to Texas as part of Juneteenth, spreading the news of freedom for all in Texas through June of 1866. So, and wrapping up, the first Freedmen's Convention as part of the freedom celebrations here in North Carolina took place in the capital of North Carolina at a historic place, a historic sanctuary, St. Paul AME Church here in Raleigh.
On Edenton Street.
Right down Edenton Street from the Museum of History and the state capitol. And in September and October of 1865, an Assembly of African Americans, formerly called the Convention of the Freedmen of North Carolina, but often, as I refer to it as the Freedmen's Convention, organized in Raleigh to draft a strong message for delivery to the legislature ratifying the 13th Amendment at the Capitol. So the state legislature was slated in a special session to convene at the state capitol in November, December 1865 to vote on the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. So what they wanted to do, that freedom message asked the white legislators to provide legal protections for Black people and just compensation for their labor, options for education of Black children, and aid for orphans and assistance with unification of families that had been split during slavery. So part of the commemoration aspect of Juneteenth, Chrystal, is that reunification of that family reunions that we always have on Juneteenth. Well, that rose out of the fact that after slavery, one of the first things that we were doing was going to look for our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our sons, our grandmothers, our aunties, our uncles, all of our family, and reuniting and have a family reunion. And that reunification or that family reunion is embedded as part of Juneteenth and as part of our capital city Juneteenth celebrations at historic Dix Park here in Raleigh. The reunion of the enslaved Hunter family that were at Spring Hill at Dix Park will also be part of that event. The significance of Juneteenth, as I mentioned, freedom for all. And what you see on the screen is the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it reads verbatim, slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States or any territory subject to its jurisdiction, except as a punishment for a crime whereof that party would have been duly convicted. That's another whole topic. But it was ratified by those special legislative sessions on December 4th, 1865 at our historic state capitol across Edenton Street from the North Carolina Museum of History. And we were the 26th state to do so. And this is very significant because there were 11 Confederate states. If you take 11 from 36, at least 25. So we were actually the 26th and we put it over.
Wow.
And so when we did, I would say our cousins in Georgia, you know, because we're all related, the cousins in Georgia, 2 weeks later, 2 days later, ratified it and became the 27th state of the 36 in the Union, making it 3/4 necessary, and it became law. And so now freedom for all. And again, freedom for all because slavery perverted our entire society. It afflicted, obviously, our enslaved ancestors, but it also perverted and warped the society in general with laws and customs. It affected white people adversely. It affected Indian people, young, old, because the slave codes mandated that you treat enslaved and Black people as subhuman.
Mhm.
And so this law on the books is meant to reverse 200 years of customs and mores that have been going on in North Carolina from the 1600s through 1865, and Virginia as well. So what the convention did do as a parting shot, though, is they passed a resolution asking for the removal of the colored troops from North Carolina.
Mhm.
And what you see is a transcript of that, and that is resolved that the president of this convention or the president of that special session, in behalf of this body, the state legislature, requests that the president of the United States, who at that time was President Andrew Johnson, by the way, he was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, and later moved to Tennessee. Yes. If not incompatible with the public interest, to order the removal from the state of North Carolina at the earliest practicable period of all of the colored troops now in service of the United States within the limits of the said state, as the presence of these troops is, in the opinion of this convention, very injurious to the quote colored people and excessively annoying to the white people of this state, ratified 17th of June, October 1865. This resolution was passed as a condition to actually debate the 13th Amendment that was actually ratified. And so the US War Department and the federal government removed the US colored troops from the state of North Carolina. Some of them actually went out to Texas. Some of them went to other places throughout the nation. And of course, to spread the news of Juneteenth, of Emancipation Proclamation, of the Freedom Amendment, of that 13th Amendment that we all now celebrate, freedom for all. So thank you, Chrystal.
Wow.
Thank you for allowing me the time.
Well, I have certainly learned a lot, and we have a slew of awesome questions, but unfortunately, we're going to only get to a few of them because of our time. You've raised the interest for so many other topics. We could do several workshops based on just the information that we talked about tonight. So I want to start with, and this question came up really early, and I want us to quickly answer this question. It was, when did you first learn about Juneteenth, the original Juneteenth for Texans? And do you remember how old you were and how you learned about Juneteenth?
Yes, I learned about Juneteenth while as a student at North Carolina State University.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that was years after having been raised in Winston-Salem and observing Emancipation Day or First Night Watch. And so when I learned Juneteenth, I had to take into account, well, what's the difference? And then I later learned through my scholarship and research, kind of what I laid out in this presentation, that process of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
that again, it was not a proclamation. There was no Emancipation Proclamation where we were just instantly freed. It was a process. And that process was state by state, parts of state, parts of state. And as it turned out, Texas and the Western territories
Mm-hmm.
were the last parts of the United States to actually get that news.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me as a scholar and as a professional, I learned that. And we are still literally unraveling that and
Absolutely.
still literally researching it. So great question.
And I can say, I'm glad to say, this is when I think about great teachers. And I'm a former teacher, administrator, but I had a teacher named Miss Chapman at Goldsboro Junior High School in Goldsboro. And I won't say how long ago it was, but she was the first person that introduced Juneteenth to me. But at that time, we talked about it in terms of it being something important to Texas. So naturally, as a student, well, what does that have to do with North Carolina? And she was also one of the first persons that I heard say, none of us are free until all of us are free.
Exactly.
And so this notion that Juneteenth and that liberation, even though it came, later, and even the subsequent struggles, because we haven't talked about Reconstruction and what that meant for the formerly enslaved. So I wanted to get you to answer that question regarding how we learn about it. And I'm enjoying Annette Gordon-Reed. I wanted to mention her has just written a memoir on Juneteenth,
yes,
where she talks about, she's a native Texan, learning about Juneteenth and this trend now
right.
that it is becoming this national sort of celebration or commemoration. A lot of us are having conversations about how we coined Juneteenth, considering the circumstances. And so that leads into our next question.
Well, to answer that question, it is trendy Juneteenth. How do we teach it? I think using your example about learning about Juneteenth at your Wayne County schools in Goldsboro. Well, now with this type of information, we can substitute, or I shouldn't say substitute, but we can supplement and augment what we know about Juneteenth in Texas with how it affected in Goldsboro and Wayne County, and why not supplement that with the formation of the 135th United States Colored Troop Regiment there, and how they brought freedom for all. And when I say freedom for all, it's especially important to know, again, to underscore, it wasn't only our enslaved African-American ancestors who were afflicted by slavery.
Oh, absolutely.
Slavery perverted and warped our entire society. And it adversely affected whites too. And the large Indian population here in North Carolina.
And now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking about Native Americans in North Carolina and their experiences during the Civil War. I'm thinking about the word conscription.
Yes.
Which isn't something that we generally speak about as we should in our schools, about the complications of what was happening to people being forced to labor and to work for these armies. So we could really do a whole lot with that.
You're right.
I want to jump to another question. And this question deals with the decision to move the U.S. colored troops to Texas. Was that a strategic move? I want to go back to that. A strategic move to secure that region.
It was
thinking about the French and
that's a very good question. It was a strategic move,
and Mexico,
both politically and militarily, because what was going on with two things. Politically, again, we were in the process of ratifying the 13th Amendment, so you needed to have that military muscle for these other states to see the actual military subjugation of a Fort Fisher, or the military subjugation of a Richmond, or the military subjugation of a Raleigh or Columbia. So it's another thing for them to see the military subjugation of Texas, and that being processed to give them the confidence politically to vote for that ratification of the 13th Amendment. So that's a very good question. The process, though, I think we really need to understand and educate ourselves, about that, and that it just wasn't an absolute proclamation.
And nothing is. History is very complicated. We learn more and more as we dive into archives and primary sources. And with that, I want to ask, and I think this may be unfortunately, maybe our next to last question. Can you talk about, because this may take a minute, can you talk about your sources, your source material in terms of where people should go to learn more about Juneteenth and how liberation happened all over the South and in various pockets, and also the sources that you use to put your presentation together. So let's start with that.
Well,
where should people go to learn more about Juneteenth and emancipation? And can you talk more about the particular sources you use for tonight's presentation?
Well, very good question. As you see, and the archivist in me assigns a strict citation to every primary source, artifact, document, photos, oral histories, like the one from Mr. Luke Martin. And so the sources, just off the top, are the National Archives Record Administration, State Archives of North Carolina, those places. We have artifacts here at the North Carolina Museum of History. But most importantly, I want to take the opportunity as a curator and as a public historian to canvass the community, because we get artifacts, documents, and photos offered from individuals or organizations.
Right.
And so just like the identification tag, that was almost lost to a coin collector who had the wherewithal to pick up the phone and say, hey, this doesn't look like my other coins. If I bring it to Raleigh, will you look at it, or will you come to Pitt County and look at it? And so we made the connection, and I said, wow, thank you. So I would take the opportunity to canvass the audience and say, there are a lot of primary resources that are still out there in the public that belong to descendants of these individuals that are at these flea markets, that are at antique warehouses. And I think it just we need to educate ourselves on what we need to look for.
Right.
And as a young historian, you saw a couple of the Harper's Weeklies that are in my own personal collection.
Mm-hmm.
I began, as part of my research, taking the opportunity to purchase those items so that I can have in my own personal collection and have them for research, because the archives is only open for certain numbers of time.
Right.
And you have to make appointments and things like that. So I would encourage people to keep an old personal archive, so to speak, and keep a running list of artifacts, documents, photos, and individuals or organizations who may have source material.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who might have that, I would say, please contact us here at the museum, and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been an awesome learning session. Earl, thank you so much.
You're
I think
welcome.
we've all learned quite a bit tonight. There's always more to learn. That's what's so exciting about history, education, and we're excited to see where things go with these new celebrations all over the nation and world regarding emancipation. And there have been lots of historians and activists and educators who've said, we should have something to commemorate
Yes.
this event, with something to commemorate this
Right.
event. And then the next question is, well, if we're going to make this a national holiday, how do we educate people? How do we continue to have these really, really important conversations about who we are as a nation and the institutions that are foundational to our nation? So I want to say thank you all for joining us. We have several other Juneteenth programs that were mentioned earlier that will be happening throughout the week. So we want you to look at our website. Of course, we have the African American Heritage Commission that's putting together programs with the city of Raleigh. So continue to look at the museum as well for your history, education, and entertainment needs. I want to say a few other things. We also want to thank our tech help.
Yes.
They have been tremendous tonight. I want to thank Michelle Carr. We have Joel with us. I want to thank Michelle as well and Jerry, also Jerry Taylor, Michelle Carr, who is helping navigate this chat in such a beautiful and effective way.
Yes.
And again, we just want to say thank you. We appreciate our director, Ken Howard, and we want you all to stay safe. Let's continue to learn. Let's continue to grow so that we can be the best North Carolinians and Americans, United Statesians, citizens,
World citizens,
all people,
yes.
That we can possibly be. So thank you. And until next time, everyone be safe and have an awesome night.
Thank you.